Welcome to Whispers of the Void. Today we have two stories for you, The Watcher of the Waking Woods and The Echo of My Father. Sit down, relax, and enjoy. The Watcher of the Waking Woods. I have spent 3 years perfecting my lie. I told everyone that I simply lost my hiking pack in the brush and that the forest was merely quiet. But as I sit here in the safety of my living room, watching the shadows stretch across my floor, I finally have to confess what happened during those 4 days in the Blackwood Valley. It wasn't just a camping trip, it was a lesson in the price of closing one's eyes. It began on the first morning. The woods were beautiful, but there was an odd weight to the air, a density that made every step feel intentional. My companions, Elias and Sarah, were excited, laughing as we set up our base camp near a crystalline creek. I remember feeling a sense of profound peace, yet even then, there was a tiny prickle at the back of my neck. It was the sensation of being observed by something that didn't have eyes to blink. By the second night, the atmosphere shifted. We were huddled around a crackling fire when I noticed the first glitch. The woods weren't just silent, they were holding their breath. Every time we spoke, the forest seemed to echo our words back, but with a microscopic delay, a fraction of a second too late for it to be a natural reverb. Then, Sarah whispered something strange as she watched the flames. "Don't let your eyelids get heavy yet." I laughed it off, thinking she was just tired, but her eyes remained fixed on the treeline. On the third day, we woke up to find the creek had stopped flowing. Not a trickle, not a ripple, it was as if time had paused for the water. We stood in stunned silence until Elias pointed toward the pine trees. There, standing between two trunks, was a shape. It wasn't a bear or a deer, it was a tall, slender figure draped in what looked like gray lichen. It didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still, mimicking our posture. When I blinked, it was closer. When I blinked again, it was even nearer. That night, the warning became a command. We sat in a circle, our faces illuminated by the dying embers of the fire. A voice, not a sound from the woods, but a thought inside my head, whispered, "Stay awake." It wasn't a suggestion, it was an ultimatum. Around midnight, the real horror began. As soon as Sarah drifted off into a light sleep, her breathing changed. It became rhythmic and wet, like something was inhaling with her. Then, she let out a tiny gasp. When we looked at her, her hair was moving upward, as if an invisible hand were stroking it from the crown of her head. She wasn't dreaming, she was being visited. The moment she fell into a deep sleep, the figure from the woods emerged from the shadows. It moved with a fluid, gliding motion, its limbs lengthening like pulled taffy. It reached out a long, spindly finger and touched her forehead. In that instant, Sarah didn't just dream, she experienced a leak. Her eyes flew open, and for 3 seconds, her pupils were replaced by swirling patterns of gold dust. She sat up, shivering, and whispered, "It tasted my thought." By the 4th day, we knew the rules. The figure, which we began to call the Weaver, was a creature of the in-between. It lived in the space between consciousness and sleep. To fall asleep was to give it permission to enter your mind and rearrange the furniture of your soul. We decided to test its limits. We tried to stay awake for as long as possible, sipping bitter tea and propping each other up with stones on our heads. But the Weaver was patient. It began to play with us. It would create tiny hallucinations, the smell of baking bread in the middle of the woods, or the sound of a distant flute that appeared only when we were about to doze off. Then came the great drift. Around 3 a.m. on the final night, Elias finally succumbed. He let his head fall back and closed his eyes completely. The Weaver didn't just touch him, it enveloped him. His body began to stretch, becoming as long as a fallen log, while his face remained serene. For 10 minutes, he was a part of the forest floor, a living sculpture of sleep. I realized then that if we fell asleep entirely, we wouldn't just rest, we would be claimed. The Weaver would pull us into its gray world and weave our memories into its lichen-covered skin. I spent those final hours fighting the heaviness in my eyelids, watching the creature move between my friends like a weaver working on a loom. Finally, as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, the Weaver retreated. It sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement and dissolved into the mist of the morning. The forest returned to its natural rhythm. Elias snapped awake, his body shrinking back to its normal size, his hair messy, but his mind clear. We packed our gear in a focused silence. There was no need for words. We had seen the cost of a lapse in attention. We hiked out faster than we had come in, our boots crunching on the needles of the floor. I am telling you this now because I see it every time I lie down at night. I see the gray lichen and the spindly fingers reaching out from the corners of my room. I still keep a small stone by my bed, a reminder of that trip. And even though I know the weaver is there, waiting in the velvet darkness of my bedroom, I make sure to keep my eyes open just a little longer every night. Because now I know, to sleep is to invite the forest inside, and the forest is always hungry for what we think when our eyes are closed. And now, our next story. The Echo of My Father. I am writing this down because my hands are still shaking, and I need to anchor the memory before it drifts away like a dream. It happened last night, in that cavernous concrete labyrinth, the parking garage beneath the old downtown library. It started at 10:45 p.m. The air was heavy with the scent of damp oil and exhaust. I had just parked my car and was walking toward the elevator when I heard it, a low, melodic hum. It wasn't a song I recognized, but the tone was familiar, a deep, resonant vibration that felt like a physical touch against my skin. I stopped. The garage was empty, at least for 10 feet in every direction. Then, from around the corner of Pillar 14, a voice spoke. Well, isn't this a lovely evening for a walk? My heart skipped. It wasn't just any voice, it was my father's voice. But my father had been dead for 3 years. The cadence was perfect, that slight lilt at the end of his sentences, the way he would emphasize the vowels. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. I looked around. A shadow stood near a stack of crates. It was tall, slightly thin, and draped in a long, charcoal gray coat. It didn't move. It just stood there, its face partially obscured by the dim, flickering light of a dying fluorescent bulb. "Hello," I whispered. My voice felt too loud in the hollow space. The figure stepped forward into the light. It wasn't my father, not exactly. The skin was a bit too pale, and the eyes were a shade deeper than they should have been, almost like polished obsidian. But as it moved, it tilted its head with that same characteristic fatherly curiosity. "Hello, little bird," it said. My breath hitched again. Little Bird was his nickname for me. I took a step back, my heels clicking against the concrete. The stranger smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It was a bit too wide, showing just a few more teeth than necessary. Then, something shifted in its posture. Its shoulders slumped slightly, and its hand reached out to brush a phantom strand of hair from its forehead, a gesture my father did every time he was thinking. "You look tired," the stranger said, its voice now perfectly mimicking his weary evening tone. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. It wasn't just a sound, it was an imitation of a soul. I started to walk toward my car, thinking the mystery was solved. But as I passed Pillar 18, the voice came again. Wait for me. It was no longer my father's voice. It was my mother's. High-pitched, airy, and slightly hurried. I stopped in my tracks. The stranger was still there, but it had changed its stance. Its body seemed to flow like liquid. "Don't let the shadows catch you," the figure said in her voice, then immediately switched back to my father's deep hum. It was moving closer now, not with a walk, but with a gliding motion. Every few steps, it would change its personality. It would whisper in my brother's raspy growl, then transition into the soft sigh of my grandmother. It was gathering every person I loved and pulling them into its own body. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling. The stranger stopped just 3 feet away from me. The air around it felt colder. It didn't speak immediately. Instead, it seemed to be searching. Its eyes darted back and forth as if it were pulling files from a cabinet inside its head. Then it spoke in my own voice, my exact pitch, my own inflection of fear. "Because you are the one who remembers them," the stranger said using my voice. I felt a jolt of pure electricity go through me. It wasn't just mimicking the people I loved, it was trying to inhabit me. It took another step, closing the gap. The smell of old paper and ozone drifted off its coat. I could see its face clearly now. It was a masterpiece of mimicry, a blank canvas that had been painted with the colors of my life. "I can be them," it whispered, shifting back to my father's voice. "But only if you let me." It reached out a long, slender hand. The fingers were slightly too long, but the way they curved was perfect. It touched my cheek. Its skin felt like cool silk. For a second, I didn't see a stranger. For a second, I saw my father's face, my mother's smile, and my brother's grin all overlapping in one haunting visage. The garage around us seemed to fade into a blur of gray, leaving only the two of us. I realized then that it wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was an echo of everything I had ever held dear. "Take me," I whispered, half terrified and half longing. The stranger leaned in, its face inches from mine. Its eyes shimmered like water. "Then we shall be together," it said, using a voice that was a perfect harmony of everyone I loved, spoken at once. It opened its mouth to speak one final word, but before it could, the fluorescent light above us gave a violent pop and died. In that moment of absolute darkness, the stranger let out a soft sigh, a sound my father used to make when he was satisfied with a job well done. When the light flickered back on a second later, the spot in front of me was empty. The stranger was gone. There were no footprints in the dust, no lingering scent of ozone. I stood alone in the center of the garage. I walked back to my car, my heart finally slowing down. As I reached for the door handle, I heard one final sound, a faint, distant hum from the very back of the garage, as if someone were still there, practicing the voices of my life. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories, and make sure to like.